students, welcome to EkEdu. Today we're going to talk about the first chapter of your class 11, that is the living world. In this chapter we're going to learn about a lot of things about different organisms. Now if you see around yourself, you will see so many organisms. There might be a dog, a cat. If you go to a zoo, it might be an elephant, a giraffe. You see human beings, you see so many insects, so many types of ants, so many types of house flies. So you see, we are surrounded with so many organisms that it's so difficult to keep check of every organism, right? Which is why this chapter will tell you how do we deal with different organisms that are already present and the new ones that are being identified lately. Now let's start with characteristics of living. Now if we're talking about living world, we need to know what is living and what is not. You see, there are characteristics that are defined for living beings so that it's easier for us and the other people that are trying to read organisms to understand which part or which characteristics of a living person define them as living. Now, if I give you an example, a person, a human being that is in coma, will you call them living or not? So, in questions like that, these characteristics that define who living is very important and very useful for those types. So coming to the first characteristic, it talks about growth. Now if I talk about growth, growth can be in a lot of senses. For example, there is a dump of garbage, you're trying to throw dump over it and over it and over it, over it. So it will grow in size, but will you call that living? No, you won't. So growth alone cannot be a defining characteristic for any living being. If a thing is growing, that does not mean they're living. Like I gave you an example, garbage might grow in size because we're dumping over and over and over again, but that would never make it a living thing. Similarly, if you're trying to pile your books one over the other, what will you see? The size of the tower is growing, but that does not mean it's living. It's same with buildings. We concrete one brick over the other and other. There's so large buildings, there's so many large buildings that are even higher than the sky itself, but they are not growing. We're making them, right? So growth can be a lot of type, but it's an intrinsic property. Other than that, growth, if we define as a characteristic for the living people, it can be because of the growth of the mass and number of cells. Now the growth that we're talking about, I told you growth can be a lot of types. I told you about concrete, I told you about garbage and books. But the growth that we're talking about, the one that is present in living beings, let's talk about that. The growth that we're talking about here in living beings is the one that is because of the growth of number of cells. You see, we grow in height, we grow in senses, our arms and limbs become longer, right? So there are a lot of things, even our hair, they grow. Every cell that divides contributes to the growth of a living organism. This is the type of growth that we're talking about in the characteristics of a living person. Other than that, in unicellular organisms, it is about because it's only having one cell. So there's no division of cell until unless we're talking about reproduction in that organism. So in unicellular organisms, growth is interrelated with the reproduction of the organism because unicellular organisms only divide their cells when they need to reproduce. Okay, and in multicellular organisms what happens is the reproduction is a part of cell division, but we cannot only define reproduction as cell division. There are two different things. When we talk about our cells, we're multicellular, right? So what happens is when we're talking about cell division in our own body, we're talking about different type of cell divisions. Cells are dividing repeatedly in our body, but that does not mean that our body is trying to reproduce. It's not reproducing, it's just making new cells because our cells die after some time and we need new cells. So this is like a production of new cells rather than reproduction. On the other hand, like I just told you, unicellular organisms interchangeably can talk about division of cells and reproduction. Like I just said, growth can alone not be defined as a characteristic of a living being, because growth can be of a lot of types. Talking about the second characteristics, it is reproduction. Now if you talk about reproduction, different organisms reproduce in different types. There are a lot of organisms that reproduce through asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is in algae, in yeast, and there are a lot of types of asexual reproduction itself. So what happens is, what I am trying to tell you is, when an organism tries to divide itself into forming a new being which is similar to themselves, for example, an amoeba, when it divides, what it forms, it starts its division as this. They start to divide their nucleus and then they form a new amoeba, just 2 of them. Okay, but reproduction is a lot of types, and because we're talking about reproduction here, we need to talk about cells again. And it is and why is it regarded as a characteristic of living organisms? Have you ever seen your books reproduce and multiply? Have you seen your English book turn itself into 2 English books? That doesn't happen. Why? Because they are not living. Because any non-living thing is not capable of reproducing, even if they are capable of growth. That is pretty much why we say reproduction itself is defined as a characteristic of a living being. So which means every being that reproduces is considered as living, right? So in this topic I can also tell you about reproduction itself. When we're reproducing, there is no living being that reproduces, but there are different types and there are different forms. So we cannot choose one and then reject the other organism depending on what they are reproducing from. The next category is metabolism. What is metabolism? Now our body is made up of chemicals. It has a lot of chemicals. We're taking chemicals from the outside into our body every second, right? We're eating food, it has different type of chemicals. It might be acid from tomatoes or any other food that we're eating. So we're taking chemicals every second of the day, right? We're taking oxygen from the environment too. We're exhaling the carbon dioxide too. So there's this definite interaction between chemicals from the environment and the chemicals in our body. But what is metabolism? The metabolism that we're talking about is when we use those chemicals in our body to make compounds like biomolecules that are trying to help us live. Now what I'm trying to say is, for example, you eat food, you chew it, it goes into your stomach. That's where digestion starts. Our body starts to absorb the useful things out of it. But what after that? What does our body does after absorbing every useful compound from our food? Our body changes it into something that is useful for our body. For example, it changes things into glucose, because glucose can be used in our body. So this is what metabolism here means. Organisms that are capable of converting chemicals into biomolecules that are useful for their own body is called metabolism. No non-living being can perform a metabolism because they do not have right amount of cells or right amount of structure and system that will help them metabolize. So that is pretty much why organisms that can metabolize can be as a defining characteristic of a living human being or any other organism as well. Now the fourth is consciousness and sensitivity. If you see here properly, a man is trying to touch a leaf. It's a touch me not plant. So a man touched the leaf. These leaves are actually sensitive to touch, so which is pretty much why it's closing itself, right? So what this is trying to depict is every human being or every organism that is living understand what is happening around them, right? If there is fire around you, you will know it, your body will understand that it is fire and you will try and stay away from it. Similarly, this plant, which is also a living organism, is sensitive to touch. It is understanding that somebody is trying to touch them, which is pretty much why they're closing their leaves. Another example that I would like to give here is reflex action. When something is trying to hit you or somebody is trying to hit you with something, we usually flinch back from those things because we're conscious of what is happening around us. Other than that, if you see, consciousness can also be dependable upon your environment. For example, when it's too hot, you try and choose your clothes according to that. When it's too cold, you wear coats to save yourself. When it's rainy, you know to take an umbrella out. So consciousness is how you understand that your surroundings need certain changes in your body. For example, the food in regions are different. Similarly, the living habits in different region is different because they are trying to adapt in the environment that they live in. People living in Atlantica would not have the same lifestyle that us does. Where in a tropical region, beings live differently as compared to that of people living in Atlantica. So this is called consciousness. Now sensitivity. Sensitivity is very objective to organisms. Even in human beings, it is a very objective topic. When I say objective, what I mean is that the organism that we're talking about, if we're talking about two human beings, it is not necessary that they're going to be sensitive to the same thing because it is about a body that we're talking about, and no two bodies are same. So I may be sensitive to pollen grains and the other person might not be, or they can be sensitive to light and I'm not, right? So these are the things that happen. Sensitivity and consciousness is what this topic is trying to, or this characteristic is trying to tell us, is when people come into the environment, they have certain reactions to their environment which tell the other person or the observer that this organism or this being is living. Animals, these are animals like sheep and goat reproduce by seasonal breeding. Now this is a very good example of consciousness. You see, there are seasonal breeders. The example of dogs are best because most of the people understand what a seasonal breeder is when we talk about dogs. Dogs do not reproduce the entire time of the year. They have seasons where they reproduce and there are seasons where they're dormant in that reproductive sense. So what happens is they try and detect their environment. They have a favorable season to reproduce. So when that season comes, their body detects that change and their body accepts it that this is my favorable season for reproduction, and they start reproducing, right? So this is also an example of consciousness because the organism like dogs and cats are understanding what is happening around them and changing accordingly. Now there are few things that I would like to talk about here. What it says is living organisms are self-replicating, which is obvious. Like we reproduce, our cells are replicating themselves, and we ourselves as an entire organism reproduce ourselves too. Other than that, we're evolving. What is evolution? Let's talk about evolution here because the word evolve is very important in this topic. So what happens when we're evolving is, you see, we are said to be ancestral with chimpanzees, but chimpanzees had tails that we don't, right? Similarly, there are other parts of human body too that are not in use anymore but still are there. Another example would be appendix. You must have heard people go through appendix operations too. So what I'm trying to tell here is, when you evolve in your life, what happens is you change certain things. So human beings have changed into an entire species which is different from chimpanzee, but that does not mean that we don't have a tailbone. We still do have a tailbone, just not the tail muscles, right? Which make us very different from chimpanzees. So what I'm trying to tell is, the living organisms are self-replicating and they are evolving. Let me give you a real life example of evolution. You have your parents. Not all parents know how to use a phone, but we do, right? Because the generations have evolved, right? The techniques are changing, the world is changing, the technology is growing themselves in certain ways. So what happens is we evolve with time. Our parents do not understand what we're trying to do on our phones because they belong from a generation where there was no technology. So their evolution is slower than ours because we came in middle, so we understand the technologies too. This is evolution, basic evolution. Or you can say there are a lot of things that were there in our parents' time but are not here anymore. The basic things that came from villages are extincting now because they're not in use anymore. This is another way of evolution. So trying to adapt to your environment, where you live, how you live, what are you doing in your life, all this contributes to the evolution that your body goes through. Now, evolution, other than evolution, there is also an interactive system. What is interactive system, kids? Interactive system is organisms are always dependent on each other. Like we are dependent on plants for our food, and people who are non-vegetarian are also dependent on other animals, right? So this is the interaction that we have. We are dependent on other organisms for a lot of things. Similarly, other organisms like leeches, bacteria, fungi, they are also correlated and dependent on each other. This is the interaction that I'm talking about. So different organisms interact with each other. That makes an entire biosphere. Now talking about biodiversity. When I started this session, I told you about looking around yourself and telling how many organisms do you see. Now the mixture of all those organisms that you see around yourself, from an earthworm to a fly to a bird to a dog to a cow, any ant that you see around yourself, any lizard that you may, all these are the biodiversity. The number of organisms that we have around ourselves are biodiversity. Right, so biodiversity says the number and various kinds of organisms found on the earth. So do you understand, we sitting in our room can see a lot of organisms. We might see a cockroach, or we might see a house mice, or we might see a lizard, or maybe an ant or a fly. So sitting in a room I counted 5 organisms. You see a rat, a cockroach, a lizard, an ant, and what else did I say? A fly. So yeah, we already counted 5. Do you understand? Sitting in a room, we can count 5. How many will you count when you're looking around the world? So you see, our biodiversity is so huge. Now, if you even count the types of ants that we have, there is black one, there's red one, there's huge one, there's one that can fly, there's one that with a white tail. I counted 5 types of ants too. So you see, there's so many different type of organisms around us, and we have so much biodiversity. There's so many types of tigers, there's so many types of cats, there's so many breeds of dogs even. So you see, that all makes up our biodiversity. Kids, these are the abbreviations. Now I tell you why there are abbreviations here in this slide. I talked about biodiversity. I told you there's so many organisms. But can you read each and every organism if you don't have a system to read it? You can't, because there's so much huge amount of organisms on this planet that if you start reading one, you will never understand anything. So what we tried to do is, we try to segregate them. Like, if I say a dog, it's not just one dog. You come around with a lot of breeds. You might imagine a husky, somebody might imagine a German shepherd, maybe a chihuahua, right? So there are so many type of dogs that you can imagine when I say about dogs. Why is that? Because we've characterized those organisms as dogs. And if I say about cats, you will imagine a black cat, a white cat, a brown one, a mixture, right? So there's so many types of the cats that you can imagine depending upon your personal experiences. Like that, we have divided all the organisms in a different type so that we can understand what organism is the other person or other researcher or scientist is talking about. These are the abbreviations of the systems that have helped us in nomenclature. Nomenclature is basically naming something. So we named all the organisms that looked like, that walked on 4 legs and barked as dogs, right? Every organism on 4 legs that barks, specifically only barks and not meow, is a dog. So that is nomenclature, naming the organisms. So these are the organizations and systems that helped us nomenclaturing them. So you can learn about these from your books. I really hope you will learn it because it's very important. Now coming to the main topic of nomenclature. What is nomenclature? We have a need. It's not something that I would do for fun or anybody would do for fun. Nomenclature is serious business. Nomenclature is naming. You understand, if I call you, I will call your name, right? If I call you by hey, hi, ho, you would not understand who am I calling, right? Similarly, when we're talking about organisms, we will never understand what organisms we're talking about until unless we divide them into name categories. So every organism on this planet, kids, is characterized, is named after something. That system is known as nomenclature. Every organism has a name. And why is this nomenclature is something that we're studying here is because nomenclature is the name that the organism is known from entire world. For example, nomenclature of a mango is Mangifera indica. We will tell you in the next class or maybe today about how we named mango as Mangifera indica, but let me give you an example. Nomenclature of mango is Mangifera indica. So a mango is not known as Mangifera indica just in India. Every place around the world, if you talk to somebody and you tell them that we want Mangifera indica, they will understand it's mango irrespective of the language that you're using in the country. So you might speak Hindi or English or Russian or Persian, but every person when you say Mangifera indica will understand that you're talking about a mango, which is very important because every country has their own language, every country is having their own culture. There are different types, there are different systems, the societies is different, there's so many diversity in human living systems as well. So if you use a standardized method to name something, it would make the communication very easy. Now coming to the principle of priority. Let me give you an example. If your mother named your sister something, let's say Rose, she was your elder sister, she's your elder sister, your mother named her Rose. What if your mother is trying to name you Rose again? That would be difficult. So what we do is, we use a principle of priority saying when an organism is named something, it's specific for them. And any other person naming them, for example, we usually have nicknames at our house. So Rose might be Ro, right? So calling Rose as Ro will always be a secondary name. Similarly, if we've called Mangifera indica, we've named an organism or a living organism as Mangifera indica, we will always call it Mangifera indica. If I call it mango, it is a secondary name to them, because the principle of priority says if the first name is given to an organism is valid, then every other preference would be considered as secondary or a synonym for the same word, because the priority would be given to the first name that was given to the organism. Now let's come to the nomenclature of how we named mango as Mangifera indica. Now these are the words that are taken from Latin language. So you understand, kids, what happens is when you're trying to name them globally, you're trying to use a universal system for it. So what you do is you need to have a language, you need to have a particular language. So every country will use the same language to name something, which is what we did here. We started using Latin language because at that time when the system was introduced, Latin was very famous. A lot of countries use Latin, which is pretty much why you would understand why Latin is an old language, and which is actually why we think of those names as weird or long, or I don't know if I can call a mango as Mangifera indica, you see. That's what I'm trying to say. These names are so different and so difficult sometimes to pronounce because they come from Latin language. So every name that is a biological name would come from the language Latin. Next is the name would have two parts. Now when I say two parts, you will understand that I said mango is Mangifera indica. Mangifera, the first word, indica, the second word. The first word tells about the generic name. What is generic name? Now, do you understand that there are a lot of types of mangoes around us? There are mangoes that are used for mango shapes. There are mangoes that are used for just cutting and eating them. There are mangoes that you can suck on. So, there are so many types of mangoes, you understand. So, that is a generic name. The generic name that we're talking about. The second name is specific epithet. What is this? The specific epithet is that when we're talking about one specific mango, I am talking about the mango that you cut and eat. So that specific mango is called Mangifera indica. The third point tells us about how to write those names so that we understand that this is a scientific name. This is the name that the entire world uses for mango. How do we write it? We write it as, they are always printed in italics. So they are the words that are printed in italics and are always underlined separately. What I mean by separately is that if I write Mangifera indica, I will underline these words separately. We cannot underline them like this. This is wrong. The first one is the right way of underlining a word. So this is, we usually underline the scientific word or the biological name when we're handwriting it. You see, when we're printing it on a computer, we can just use italics to show that this is a biological name. But when we're handwriting, there is no italics that we can write in with our hands, right? Some people naturally have an italic handwriting, some people have a block writing. So to differentiate between different handwritings, we made a rule of always underlining a biological name so that we can differentiate the normal word from a scientific biological name. Now, the fourth point says the first word will always start with a capital letter, which means if you clearly see here, I started Mangifera M with a capital, right? This is a capital because the rules say so. You always write a biological name with the first alphabet as capital. On the other hand, you can always write the name of the author at the end of it. So if I want to write the name of the author, it would be Lin, L-I-N-N, right? But it would come after indica itself, okay? So the generic name and specific epithet and the author's citation is a biological epithet, which means if I write Mangifera indica Lin, it would be a binomial epithet, which means Mangifera indica is just a biological name, right? But when we include the author's name that gave Mangifera indica its name, it will become a binomial epithet. Now student, did you understand till here? I hope you did. If you didn't, I would really like to know in the comment box what you want to ask me, right? And other than that, this chapter is halfway through, but in the next session we will talk about different types and how to name, because the names are specifically defined in a particular manner. So we'll talk about that, and there are aids that help us define these organisms and help them preserve them. So we will talk about that in the next session. I'll see you soon.